Welcome to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. Join host Susan Gibson as she summons the courage to ask the hard questions, probes deep, dark secrets, and attempts to fill in the gaps while exploring the relationship between her and her mother. Discover the magic of self-discovery, relationship exploration, and the profound journey of forgiveness. Now, your host, Susan Gibson.
Have you ever really explored your origin story? Not only the facts of your birth, but the lives of your parents and their circumstances leading up to your birth? Here's my origin story, part fact, part feelings, and all part of my family fairy tale. My parents married young. My mother had just turned 19. My father was 18. He would turn 19 later that year. They were married in a small community, rural community in northern Maine, where my mother was born and raised, and her family had been living there for generations. My dad was new to the area. He was born and raised in north central Mississippi and joined the Air Force right out of high school and got stationed in rural northern Maine. And they met and they fell in love and they got married. And 11 months later, they had a baby boy, my brother Edward. And he died 6 hours after childbirth. And then I came along 3 years later, April 28th, 1962. And, the death of my brother was not a secret. It was not a family secret. It was just something that nobody spoke about. I was aware I had a brother who had died. I was very young when that awareness first came in to my existence. And, growing up in a small rural community, very family-oriented experience, we spent visits to cemeteries to visit our loved ones who had passed away and to visit with each other on those visits to the community cemetery. And my brother was buried there. And his tombstone was in the shape of a little lamb. And so as a small child, I remember playing with the little lamb. And I still have that tombstone in my possessions. It's since been replaced with another tombstone, but I still have that little lamb. But it wasn't real to me. It was a fairy tale. And it didn't become real to me until I was still at a very young age, but I could read. And my timeline of my childhood is kind of punctuated with where we were living at any given point in time, which house we were in. And so we were in a house that I lived in until about the age of 8 with my parents. So I was very young, but I could read. And I was playing one day make-believe, as little kids do, with my mother's pocketbooks. And inside one of her pocketbooks, there was a newspaper clipping. And it was a very short obituary of my brother. And even though I was a small child, I knew that something had changed in me by reading that obituary, that fairy tale of a brother who had died became a fact. Because it was in the newspaper. It had the facts. It had the facts there. I never questioned it, though. Even though I was a deeply inquisitive child and still remain a very inquisitive adult, I never questioned it. I put the newspaper clipping back into the pocketbook where I found it, and I put my mother's pocketbooks back into her closet, and life went on. My life went on. But something did shift in me in that moment, when that realization of going from a fairy tale of a brother who died to a fact. Fundamentally different shift in my life experience up until that moment. And what I found out over the years was that my mother had a very difficult pregnancy, both with my brother Edward and with me. And that she had to take what were considered miracle drugs in the early 60s that helped women have a viable pregnancy. And she took one of those during her pregnancy with me. And while there weren't many stories shared about that period in our life together, that one was shared with me, because when I started menstruating at a young age, I was 12 or 13 at the time, my mother made a very distinct point of making sure that I saw a gynecologist. And she wanted to make sure that there was nothing wrong, because this drug was known to cause cancer in the female children of the mothers who took this drug. And so that awareness was very strong in me. And I started seeing a gynecologist at a very young age because of that. So that was one story that had been shared. And again, it's in the fact column, if you will. It's a fact. It's a fact of the pregnancy that my mother had with me. It was a fact of my birth and a fact of my coming into menstruation, and a fact of my life from that moment forward and seeing a gynecologist. I also know that with stories that my dad has shared with me over the years, very scarce stories from my mother or my father, but that my mother was bedridden through the pregnancy. And very recently, he shared a story with me that every time she went for her checkup with her doctor, with her obstetrician, that they always brought an overnight bag, because there was always this urgency that she may have to be admitted to the hospital at any time. And so as I reflect on my birth and my origin story, I've realized that there were no stories of my birth. There were no stories of the expectant mother and the anxious father awaiting the arrival of their child. No stories about the birth itself and the circumstances leading up to the birth. And over the more recent years with my mother, she shared with me that when she was pregnant with me and we're leading up to my birth, she allowed no joy. She allowed herself to not feel joyful. She allowed no celebrations, no baby showers, no gifts, no visitors, no greeters at the hospital when she was giving birth, no greeters at home, nothing. And what I've realized was that prevented us from bonding. She was terrified. I didn't know that. I just knew that we never really bonded as mother or daughter. One thing she shared with me was when she did bring me home from the hospital, that she said to me, "I don't know how to be your mother, and you don't know how to be my daughter, but we're going to figure it out." And it took us a lifetime. It took us a lifetime of trying to figure that out. The fights, the miscommunications, the misunderstandings, the love, the fun, the adventures, the hurt without knowing where it was coming from. And what a story she shared with me about my brother Edward, and this was just not long before she passed away. It came up around a death of a child. And she shared with me that the hardest thing she ever had to do was give back all the gifts that she was given and her baby shower and being an expectant mother with expecting the birth of my brother Edward, and giving away all the things that she and my father had purchased for the arrival of their first child, that joyful expectancy and nervous anxiety of welcoming a child into the family for the first time. And all of these stories, as sparse as they've been over my life, were beginning to fill some gaps. This feeling between my mother and me, this distance that we always felt, that we didn't know how to fill with each other. Try as hard as we did, it took us a long, long time to just accept those gaps for what they were. We never talked about it. We never questioned one another. We never went deep into the emotions of my birth and her pregnancy with me. Never explored what was going on, the fear that she must have been feeling, the dread, the inability to allow joy in an otherwise very joyful event in the life of a human being, in the life of a mother and child. And it has had a deep impact on me as an adult. And I've spent my lifetime trying to get back to something with my mother. And when I came to the realization, having pieced together all of these stories that I've heard over these years, I realized that it's not about going back. There's nothing to go back to. It's about trying to figure out from this moment forward. And when I started to make that realization, I experienced another shift, that I needed to create new experiences with my mother, not try to get back to previous experiences, that I needed to form a new relationship with my mother, not try to get back to a relationship that had its fragments and tatters and moments of fun, of course, moments of playfulness, moments of joy, moments of love, but also moments of distance and hurt and pain. And part of these stories that I've pieced together over the years are all the photographs that I have of me as a child and me as an adult with my mother. And there are not many photos of she and I, and of just she and I. And those that I do have, aside from those when I was an infant and had to be held, we're not touching in those photos. There's a distance. So I grew up with an emotional distance and a physical distance from my mother, and had that realization, that feeling deep inside of me, even though I was a small child when these realizations were made around the death of my brother, starting to learn about the circumstances of surrounding my birth. Those shifts were happening inside of me. Those realizations were happening deep-seated, so very deep down inside of me, that it has taken, like I say, a lifetime for these stories to come to the surface, for me to better understand what my parents were going through when they were expecting me as their child. And one thing that I've realized, my mother did love me deeply. She just didn't know how to express that love. And when she did pass away and had her celebration of life ceremony, I'd asked her one surviving sibling, her youngest brother, if he wanted to share a few words. And he wrote a short letter to my mother that I read in her celebration of life ceremony. And one thing that he said was, that his sister Alice, my mother, she got married and started her family, lost her first child, and then she had Susan. She was her pride and joy. And I knew that deep inside of me, but we'd never expressed that to one another, my mother and I. The pride and joy that we had. We expressed it through experiences. We expressed it through actions. We told each other we loved each other very much, but we never went any deeper with one another. And I went through meditation just about 6 weeks ago. And it's a practice that I've started about 2 years ago. And this was a new guide. And to be honest with you, I don't even remember what she was saying now. It was a short meditation, 20 minutes. And when it started, and she started, I went deep into a meditative state. And I was sitting in our study slash salon slash office, very quiet environment. The doors were shut. The ceiling fan was on. I was sunk into our blue velvet sofa. It's a very deep sofa. And I had my head resting back on the back of the sofa, breathing deeply, getting into that meditative state, went deep into that meditative state. And the feeling started with my hair. And my hair is a very strong part of my personal style. And if you've seen any photos of me or my bio for this podcast, you'll see, I have long, curly, mostly gray hair, and it's always been just a significant part of me and expressing my style. But this meditation, this feeling started with my hair. And through this deep meditation, I could no longer feel my hair. And it wasn't that it become light or anything. I could not feel it. I could feel the gentle breeze from the ceiling fan on my scalp. And I realized I had become a baby. And I was bald as an infant. And I was a baby in that moment. And I asked my mother, how could you not love me? I'm just a little baby. And I sobbed and sobbed silently. Spasms of sobs just racking my body, tears flooding down my cheeks, soaking onto my chest. I haven't sobbed like this in I don't remember when. Then I realized Mom did love me. I was a deep realization, more than just saying I love you and having that feeling. It was deep, deep inside of me. She loved me to my core, but she was afraid, and she passed that fear on to me. And perhaps fear was our original bond. What were your first feelings, your first memories? I'm still exploring mine, trying to fill the gaps, finding the courage to ask more questions. I invite you to share the story of your birth, your first feelings and memories, the circumstances around your birth and your parents with me. You can send me an email at hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com. Thank you for being with me today and listening to my podcast, Finding Forgiveness, a Family Fairy Tale. I welcome your comments. A big thanks to Produce Your Podcast, my production company, and the awesome team there that I'm working with to make all of this a reality. Until next time, I'm Susan Gibson, signing off with gratitude and appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Finding Forgiveness, a family fairy tale podcast. To continue the conversation, visit findingforgivenesspodcast.com and send an email to hellosusan@findingforgivenesspodcast.com to share your story. Until we meet again.